The Eiffel Tower, up for sale? Hard to believe, but master swindler Victor Lustig convinced his mark that it was. A medical marvel. Was Dr. Abrams' box a remedy for the sick, or only designed to enrich the scoundrel who created it? These works of art, bearing the signature of Dutch master Johannes Vermeer, today hang in museums as masterworks of deception. Do you believe everything you see on the news? How about a nationally reported story about a computer that determines the guilt or innocence of suspected criminals? Host James Randi, professional skeptic and debunker of frauds, takes us through the conception, the setup, and the payoff of these remarkable scams.
We've all heard that anything too good to be true probably is. But the charm and ingenuity of a great con artist can make us believe that maybe, just this once, fortune has swung in our favor. How does the scam artist do it? What principles of human nature play into the scoundrel's hand? And when it's all done, are we any wiser or just poorer? From seasoned swindlers like the globe-trotting Victor Lustig and boomtown hustlers like Soapy Smith, to the vengeful genius of painter Han van Meegeren and modern-day media hoaxer Joey Skaggs, the scam and the scoundrel have remained remarkably unchanged through the centuries. I'm James Randi, and in this special presentation, we'll look at the inner workings of some of history's most outrageous scams and the confidence men behind them. Now, most cons follow a very simple set of rules. The first rule is that the con artist always wins. Few men have earned the title among criminals of King Con. Victor Lustig was one of them. An aristocrat of the underworld, he was known to his peers as Count Lustig. The caper that immortalized him as one of the greatest confidence artists in history occurred in Paris, where he lined up a scheme to sell something that weighed 11,000 tons and didn't belong to him. It's been said that every society gets the crooks it deserves. In a world where wealth and prestige are admired, the con disguises himself accordingly, often playing the role of an aristocrat or high government official. In times of change and social upheaval, the con enjoys a greater freedom to masquerade across the boundaries of class and wealth. The successful con artist is always a kind of mirror for the time and place in which he operates. And there couldn't have been a riper time and place for Victor Lustig than Paris, 1925. After World War I, the youth of France was happy to be alive and sought to create a new social order with more freedom and greater opportunity. Expatriates of all kinds descended in droves upon the City of Light. A new class of entrepreneur emerged, made wealthy by the rebuilding of Europe. It was a city filled with effervescent excess. Here, amidst the creative fervor, the nouveau riche mingled with old money, and exiles from Prohibition America and Bolshevik Russia converged in what seemed to be one big party. Paris was ripe for change, and anything seemed possible. The perfect place for Victor Lustig to pull off the swindle of a lifetime. As a young man, Lustig left his birthplace in Eastern Europe, and by the time he was 20 years old, had already proven his talent as a first-rate grifter. His gift for languages and his easy charm served him well in his partnership with the infamous card sharp Nicky Arnstein. Together, they worked the big ocean liners which sailed between Paris and New York, ships which were always rife with gullible and wealthy marks. When he left Arnstein, Lustig had a booty of $35,000, and he headed for Paris. By now an experienced confidence trickster, he moved gracefully in society. Always stylish, always in control, and more importantly, always looking for the next opportunity to work a scam. It came to him one spring day through an intriguing article in the local newspaper, which provided the Count's cunning mind with enough material for a caper of truly monumental proportions. According to the daily press, the Eiffel Tower was in a terrible state of disrepair, and estimates on its upkeep were astronomically high. The price of a new coat of paint alone could reach into the hundreds of thousands of francs. Lustig's inventive mind went to work. What would happen if the city decided it could no longer afford the tower? Would they dare tear down this glorious spire? What an enormous and controversial job that would be. Who would do it? There would have to be a contract, he supposed, and where there's a contract, there's usually a bid. Lustig's scheme was taking shape. Always the chameleon, Lustig would transform himself into a high government official. His disguise would have to be flawless, every detail perfect. He hired a forger to create counterfeit government stationery and sent 6 of Paris' leading scrap metal dealers authentic-looking invitations to attend a very secret meeting. So secret, it couldn't be held at City Hall. Lustig chose a grand setting to lay his trap. The magnificent Hotel Crillon on the Place de la Concorde was an exclusive meeting place for diplomats, dignitaries, and royalty. One could hardly enter its doors without feeling a certain sense of heightened expectation, even perhaps a bit of self-importance. All 6 scrap metal dealers responded to Lustig's invitation and attended the meeting, each one put at ease by the presence of his successful colleagues. And by the time the Count had introduced himself as the Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Post and Telegraph, well, they were convinced that they were all going to be part of something very significant and perhaps profitable. He told the dealers that they had each been handpicked for their flawless reputation as honorable businessmen. Then, in a hushed voice, Lustig explained that due to the exorbitant cost of its upkeep, the city had no choice but to tear down the Eiffel Tower. The men were shocked. Lustig pressed on. Because of the certainty of public outcry over this matter, the news could not be revealed until all the plans were in place. He explained that he would have the duty of selecting the man to carry out the demolition.
The idea that the Eiffel Tower was going to be sold for scrap, again, wasn't all that goofy. It was in serious need of repairs. You look upon it today as this thing which you know, Paris wouldn't be Paris without it, but back then it wasn't quite as famous.
No doubt there were many people who would have preferred it come down. They could not yet see it as a permanent feature of the Parisian landscape necessarily. It didn't look like any of the most well-known monuments of the city, like the Opera House or any of the Gothic cathedrals and churches. It looked more like a machine, and as a machine, it had the look of quickness.
Monsieur, la Tour Eiffel, s'il vous plaît. From the meeting, Lustig whisked all 6 men into a limousine for a special tour of the tower. It was a calculated move. Understanding human nature as he did, Lustig wanted to dangle the prize before their eyes.
Gentlemen, the tower was never meant to be permanent. As you know, it was built for the 1889 exposition with a 20-year concession to Mr. Eiffel. In 1909, it was to have been taken down and reassembled somewhere else. This, of course, didn't happen. Unlike our city's other monuments, the tower is made of 15,000 prefabricated parts which can be assembled and disassembled. Think of the uses, collectible and otherwise, to which these highly ornamented parts could be put, and imagine their value.
The outing also gave the Count the chance to observe the men individually and pick which would be his mark, the victim he would cut from the herd.
He had a set of rules that in order to sort of get people to trust you. One thing is you listen very patiently to people. You don't look bored. You don't express controversial opinions until the mark tells you what his opinion is, and of course you agree with him. You know, that's, you know, naturally. You do not try to pull personal information out of the mark, even if you want it and really sincerely need it. Don't try to pull it out, because people are going to tell you. Just let it ride, let him talk. He's going to tell you what you want to know. You don't brag about yourself. You brag about yourself, people don't trust you. You have to exude the authority. It has to look right.
Once they were back on the ground, Lustig asked the gentlemen to submit their bids by the next day, and he reminded them that they were in possession of a state secret. The next morning, bids from all 6 dealers arrived, but Lustig had already made his choice. The dubious honor would go to the socially insecure and very ambitious André Poisson. Lustig had easily picked up on his desire to join the business elite of Paris. If Lustig was the perfect con artist for the times, Poisson was the perfect mark. He was from the new class of wealthy entrepreneurs who had made a fortune after the war, and he had plenty to prove. The old boy network had shut him out of Parisian high society, and Poisson wanted in. What better way than to win the Eiffel Tower contract?
One can imagine that a provincial scrap metal dealer would see this as the means to really make his fortune. It was really an attractive prize for someone like that. Perhaps the grandeur of the deception was the key to its success. The tower, of course, itself was always a grand object, always subject to very exalted kinds of attentions, whether by artists or by planners. It made people think globally. It made people think big, and it certainly made Poisson think big as well.
5 lucky scrap metal dealers had narrowly escaped Lustig's trap. With Poisson in his net, Lustig was one step closer to a small fortune, but he was also at risk. Impersonating a deputy minister, larceny? Lustig knew that if he were caught and stood in front of a French judge, his cheeky scam would be severely punished. Lustig's fears were justified. In fact, Poisson's wife had become suspicious. She questioned her husband. Why was the meeting not held at the ministry? Did André know this official? Why was the city's plan being enacted with such haste?
Now, at this point, Lustig realized that all Poisson had to do was make a few discreet inquiries, and the game was finished. So what did he do? Quit? Run? Oh, no. Not as long as there was some chance of saving this game. He showed his true mettle as a genuine confidence artist. He not only had proven he was clever, he was now about to show that he had nerves of steel.
Well, one thing is a risk taker. I mean, you're out there scamming people, and you don't know. Hey, maybe they'll find you up. Maybe they'll put you in jail. He did go to jail a couple of times. Maybe they'll shoot you. I mean, he was a card sharp for a while. You know, sometimes somebody catches you with the wrong cards. Bang, that's it. He seemed to enjoy that kind of danger, that kind of risk.
Lustig knew he had to act. He set out to meet his mark that evening back at the hotel, this time in private. There he confessed, or so it seemed.
Monsieur Poisson, I'm sorry we have to meet like this, but it's important we understand each other. I'm a government official. I'm expected to live in a certain style so as to maintain the dignity of France. I must dress well and entertain on a lavish scale. I don't have to tell you that I make only a pittance. My life is precarious. When a premier falls, my job is on the line. And so it is that in the letting of government contracts, I maintain my security. It is customary for the official in charge to receive a commission.
Poisson was relieved. Finally, he understood this official's mysterious behavior. Lustig wanted a bribe. Poisson smugly reached inside his jacket and removed his wallet.
When Lustig asked him, on top of a blank check, for a bribe For himself, as a poor government official, Poisson took this as proof that Lustig was in fact a bona fide government official. He was used to the idea of bribery as part of the everyday business of government, and provided these two checks.
You know, he posed as a government official, but he posed as a corrupt government official. You give me, you grease my palm, and I'm going to give you the inside track on that. And all of a sudden, here in the mind of this somewhat greedy, probably not terribly bright, but hey, maybe not so very different from the rest of us, scrap dealer, came the idea that, aha, now I understand. I understand the secrecy. I understand you. You're a crook. You're the kind of crook I'm used to dealing with. Well, he was a crook, of course, but he was a very, very different kind of crook.
You see, in Poisson, Lustig had discovered the perfect partner, the mark who wants to believe.
The con works, one, because the con man is good, but secondly, because, we meet him more than halfway. In a lot of these cases, there's more than a little larceny in the heart of the person who is being conned.
Lustig was in danger. Poisson would call the ministry, and then very likely the police. Lustig hopped a train to Vienna with a suitcase full of Poisson's money. He checked into one of the city's best hotels and watched the papers for news of the scam. But nothing appeared. Apparently, Poisson was too embarrassed to tell anyone that he'd been had.
Poisson was left calling the city on the phone to saying, when should I show up to help take down the tower? And we can imagine that the ministry was rather amused by the foibles of the unfortunate victim.
6 months later, Lustig was back in Paris. Taking advantage of the fact that Poisson had felt too humiliated to report the scam, Lustig made his way back to the Hotel Crillon. He reasoned that if Poisson hadn't told the police, he certainly would not have told his competitors.
He worked his racket all over again, this time with a different set of scrap dealers, and remarkably enough, he sold that Eiffel Tower a second time.
The entrepreneurial spirit is crucial to the lesson of the tower, whether it be Eiffel as the enlightened entrepreneur who, through his dynamic understanding of the possibilities of technology, builds something useful and also profitable. Poisson taps into the same spirit, hoping that he too can be part of this great story. And then Lustig, I don't know if we can call him an entrepreneur, we certainly can call him someone who understood those desires and capitalized on them very, very well.
Now, when you look at the Eiffel Tower, what do you see? Do you see a magnificent monument to the spirit of the city? Or do you see the opportunity perhaps to make a few fast francs? I think Lustig saw both. Much of Victor Lustig's genius lay in his ability to understand the psychology of his mark and anticipate their next move. After Paris, Lustig returned to the U.S., where he pulled off dozens of scams. He was finally arrested for counterfeiting and sent to Alcatraz. By the time of his death in 1947, Lustig's career had become legendary. When the clerk filling out his death certificate came to the box marked occupation, he paused, then wrote salesman, thus paying a final tribute to the crafty count who sold the Eiffel Tower, not once, but twice.
The dawn of the 20th century. Future generations will look back with awe at a cavalcade of new inventions. The radio, the cathode ray tube and X-rays, the McGregor Rejuvenator.
That's right, the McGregor Rejuvenator. It reverses the aging process. In its time, this worthless device relieved a lot of people of their money, and today can be found here in the Museum of Questionable Medical Devices in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the final resting place, we hope, of hundreds of quack devices that promised miracles but delivered nothing. This helmet, for example, promised to cure baldness by means of vacuum. Let's see. Drat. I guess you have to leave it on a little bit longer. But no other apparatus here compares with the creations of Dr. Albert Abrams of San Francisco, a brilliant diagnostician whose inventions cured tens of thousands of people of deadly diseases. Or did they? In the early 1900s came technical wonders never seen before. Powered flight, electricity, moving pictures. Were these inventions science or miracles? The line between the two had never seemed so blurred. If the new technologies were astonishing in their effects, their explanations were even more mysterious to the general public. Freud's unconscious, Pasteur's germ theory, and Madame Curie's discovery of radioactivity all demanded that people believe in the invisible. Reputations were made and industrial empires were built on these new discoveries.
At a time when science was really developing and technology was beginning to explode, would have been ready-made for somebody to exploit the weak and the vulnerable. And if you've got some sort of a device that sounds mystical, but you have the credentials of a medical doctor, then that puts you in a pretty good position to control other people.
From an early age, Albert Abrams seemed destined for greatness. He was born in San Francisco in 1863 and received a medical degree from the University of Heidelberg while he was still in his teens. He became chief pathologist at the Cooper Medical Institute, which was to become the Stanford Medical School. Abrams was a doctor's doctor. His diagnostic skills were sought after by other established physicians, and he published hundreds of articles in leading medical journals. His patients came from the elite of San Francisco society. Abrams, who moved among the Bay Area smart set, insisted that his letterhead list all his titles and all of his degrees.
He was a charismatic person, quite a handsome, well-dressed individual. He had a lot of social graces, and he managed to move in the right society, and he seems to have been very convincing. He seemed to be a consummate manipulator, and that's really the recipe for success as a con artist, to kind of know what makes people tick, even perhaps better than they know themselves.
But conventional honors, however great, were not enough for Albert Abrams. In a letter he wrote, "My goal is to become a prophet among men, a wise man who will have both wealth and power." In 1912, he announced that, contrary to all that had been taught before, electrons, not individual cells, were the basis of life. The doctor called his new theory of disease ERA, Electronic Reactions of Abrams, and unveiled a powerful new machine called the Dynamizer. It was the latest in medical technology. With this new invention, Abrams claimed he could diagnose any known disease from a single drop of blood. Now, this invention was remarkably similar to another invention, a real one called wireless or radio. And Dr. Albert Abrams was able to see that radio was going to change the way that people could communicate right across the world. And he was among the first to exploit the similarity between his so-called invention and real science. The current mystique surrounding electricity and radio waves provided the perfect environment for Abrams to sell his new diagnostic theory to the public. If a simple box plugged into a wall could capture voice and music from the airwaves, it seemed that similar electric boxes could do just about anything. Though people might not fully understand how it worked, they were ready to accept another exciting example of new technology into their homes.
Abrams seems to have had this wonderful innate grasp of the psychology of his patients. His devices had beautiful cabinets, just like the radios that people had at home. And so they tread this very fine line. On the one hand, they were homey and reassuring enough that people would be willing to submit to them. They weren't these sort of frightening Dr. Frankenstein-like devices. On the other hand, they were still high-tech circa 1920, and that already raised people's hopes and made them think that there really was something to these wonderful gadgets.
Well, he was offering a very comforting idea, a comforting product. There were patients out there who were going to demand it because it seemed state-of-the-art, it was high-tech for its era, and they were going to demand it from their conventional practitioners, even if those practitioners themselves might have been a bit dubious about it.
With Abrams' solid reputation behind it, by 1918, the dynamizer was becoming a national sensation. But Abrams could see that greater opportunities lay ahead. While a diagnosis is made only once, an illness can require many treatments. A machine that could cure disease would keep patients returning again and again. Abrams soon unveiled a second device. The oscilloclast. It used the readings from the dynamizer to cure the diagnosed illness. After the dials were precisely set, electrons would be beamed into the patient's body and shatter the destructive electronic vibrations of the disease.
The crux of Dr. Abrams' technology is really summed up in these two devices, the dynamizer and the oscilloclast. You took the sample of blood, ran a magnet over it to polarize it, put the blood sample in the dynamizer, put the lid on. This would measure the vibration rate of that blood sample and send it to this oscilloclast. Dr. Abrams often had his chauffeur or valet stand on a metal plate, and by tapping this healthy person's abdomen, he was able to diagnose the patient's illness. These are various blood samples sent to Dr. Abrams in 1920, along with letters from physicians and so forth and healers. He put those blood samples in his machine and was able to diagnose that most of them had 4 to 5 ohms of resistance, designating that they had syphilis, cancer, and diabetes.
Abrams boasted that the treatment was painless, that it eliminated the need for drugs and surgery, and that, for an additional $5, it could be done over the phone. How preposterous, you say?
It's important to understand that the medical field at that time was not quite what we think of medicine as being today. After all, during even much of just the previous century, the man who buried you, the man who treated you, and the man who cut your hair were probably all the same professional. Medicine was part of the healing arts. It had only recently started to become something that people would think of as a science.
With no laws regulating the manufacture of medical devices, it was a heyday for quackery of every kind. Phrenology, the measuring of bumps on people's heads, became a popular diagnostic tool. And doctors claimed that anything from tuberculosis to the mumps could be remedied by a dose of one of the hundreds of patent medicines on the market, most of which consisted of a mixture of corn syrup and morphine.
Well, I think it was a famous Canadian physician, Sir William Osler, who, until about the turn of the century, the chances that any average person going to his or her doctor would come away better rather than worse was only about 50-50.
By 1920, Abrams' electrotherapy cult was booming. Tens of thousands of people sought the painless treatments. Doctors and alternative healers from around the country flocked to his San Francisco clinic, where for $200 apiece, they too could learn to detect the mysterious electronic reactions. Finally, Abrams was receiving the acclaim he felt was rightfully his. He was also raking in a fortune. For $250 down and $5 a week, a great deal of money for that time, his students were allowed to lease one of the 4,000 authorized Abrams machines being churned out by a local factory. There was only one condition: The machines could not be opened. Abrams insisted that this could damage the delicately tuned mechanism.
Abrams' reluctance to let other people look at his little black boxes and so on makes sense from a number of perspectives. One is maybe there's nothing there, and he knows that, so why expose it? I mean, I'm putting on such a good show and people are excited about it. I'm doing all right as it is, so why take a chance? The other possibility is that he may actually have sincerely believed that he was onto something and that he wanted to protect it. He had proprietary interest in it. It's almost like a patent in his own mind.
During his heyday, Abrams was called upon by lay people and even the courts for expert testimony. In a high-profile paternity case, he claimed he could identify the father by analyzing the vibrations in his blood using his wonderful machine. Abrams claimed his machines could do far more than merely diagnose illness. They could also determine your religion, your inclination for romance, and whether or not you like to bet on the ponies. By 1921, over 3,500 medical doctors practiced Abrams' electrotherapy. Dozens of clinical reports were published by ERA doctors. They documented the successful treatment of patients, non-surgical, non-pharmaceutical cures for uterine cancer, tuberculosis, and syphilis. These doctors made between $1,000 to $2,000 a week using Abrams' leased boxes. Conventional doctors were becoming more and more incensed. Aside from their unwillingness to believe Abrams' outrageous claims, they had their own reasons for wanting to discredit him. Thousands of their patients defected to medical practitioners using radionic treatments. For the traditional physician, a new Abrams machine in town meant an empty waiting room and a vastly reduced income. Then, in 1923, came a chilling case report from a leading medical journal. A man in his 70s was diagnosed at the Mayo Clinic as having inoperable cancer of the stomach. After receiving a series of electrotherapy treatments from an Abrams practitioner, he was told by the practitioner that his cancer was gone and that he was completely cured. A month later, he was dead. Abrams' increasingly grandiose claims were about to put him on a collision course with the American Medical Association. In this world, there are many different sorts of scoundrels. Some only take your money. But Dr. Abrams was of a higher, or perhaps lower, order. You see, the stakes in his scam turned out to be human lives. Was Abrams a true visionary or just a quack preying on the hopes of the desperately ill? A nationwide battle raged between AMA establishment physicians and Abrams defenders. The issue could only be resolved by a scientifically respected neutral party.
So many people had been writing to Scientific American saying, this wonderful Abrams technique is the scientific discovery of the new century. Surely you'll be learning and writing more about this, that it caught the editor's attention. Naturally, it would be a terrific subject for any kind of scientific investigation. There were, too, though, these charges by people in the medical community that the whole thing was a fraud, that it couldn't possibly work. Scientific American put together a team of people to study the Abrams technique.
A senior Abrams practitioner, known for purposes of the study as Dr. X, was chosen to conduct the first test. 6 vials containing unknown germ cultures were delivered to his laboratory. He was to correctly identify the contents of each one. The Scientific American Committee looked on as Dr. X carried out the elaborate procedure. In accordance with Abrams' technique, a healthy young man wired to the dynamizer stood on 2 metal plates facing west under dim light. When the doctor announced his results, they were completely consistent in one respect. They were all wrong.
Dr. X's results from this trial were spectacularly unsuccessful. He managed to get all 6 vials completely wrong. Naturally, he was trying to figure out what had gone wrong. So he then asked to examine the vials, and he said, well, there's the problem. He pointed to the fact that the vials had each been labeled and that the labels had red on them. Well, Red, he said, was a color that was full of all kinds of electrical vibrations that set up bad reactions in the dynamizer's diagnostics. So, of course, it couldn't possibly be accurate. So they started over. They took off all the old labels, they put on new plain white labels, they gave the specimens back to Dr. X, and again, he managed to get every one completely wrong.
Letters poured in vehemently protesting the investigation.
On the one hand, you had some people who felt vindicated by these results, who said they'd always thought it was probably a fraud. You had, on the other hand, the people who were strong believers in the Abrams technique, and many of them started off by saying, why are you subjecting this wonderful, wonderful procedure to any kind of scientific scrutiny? After all, aren't there thousands of people walking around who've been cured by this already?
Undaunted, the Scientific American Committee continued its investigation. Abrams offered to demonstrate his machines for them at his San Francisco laboratory, but the committee insisted on carrying out the investigation on their own terms.
But he wouldn't really submit. He never refused to participate in the studies, but he would always beg off submitting to some kind of real blind trial of the work. As a result, the technique was never demonstrated by its inventor to any scientifically satisfactory degree.
Abrams struck back at his critics. In the pages of ERA publications, he accused them of scientific ignorance and of merely wanting to protect their own turf.
If he was attacked by the medical profession or the scientific profession, I suppose he could easily fall back on the argument that he now is the victim and that this big amorphous association, American Medical Association, and the establishment are really after him, and poor little me, I'm just the victim. And many of his followers would probably accept that.
The struggle between Abrams and the AMA was about to reach a climax. In 1922, an AMA doctor anonymously sent a blood sample to Abrams' clinic for diagnosis. And the analysis came back. This patient, it seemed, had malaria, diabetes, and cancer, and another disease that most of Abrams' patients seemed to have, syphilis. Then came the jarring revelation, to Abrams at least. You see, it turned out that his patient actually was living a very moral life and was quite healthy. His patient was a rock rooster. Other Abrams practitioners began getting into legal hot water. In another sting operation, an ERA doctor confidently diagnosed a patient with some very human diseases. Once again, the patient turned out to be a member of the poultry family. The star witness at the trial for mail fraud in Jonesboro, Arkansas, was to be Dr. Abrams himself. And then an unbelievable turn of events. On the eve of the trial, Abrams died. Apparently none of his wonderful devices was able to cure him of pneumonia. Dr. Albert Abrams, dead at age 62, a healer unable to heal himself.
I think that between the satisfaction that gave him in a humanitarian sense and the very real reward he was getting in terms of the money that was rolling in, it was an irresistible force for him. The man left an estate valued between, I think, $2 and $5 million. An extraordinary sum of money for somebody who was basically just hitching up sick people to radios.
Abrams had always insisted that his machines never be opened. Now that he was gone, the AMA publicly opened one.
A lot of the charlatans had the idea that if you sealed the machine, put a clamp on it, wires, that no one would look into it and discover his mysterious secret. The secret was that it was a hodgepodge of meaningless dials, wires, and lights that would expose him as a charlatan.
The Scientific American team finally concluded that the Abrams technique was a complete fraud, that in fact Dr. Abrams didn't know enough about electricity to be able to wire up a doorbell, that the dynamizer was probably nothing much more than just a black box full of wires, that you couldn't possibly get a real cure out of the oscilloclast, And their basic position was that the entire field of the Abrams technique wasn't even fit for scientific study.
We would have hoped that Abrams' ideas would have died when he died, but unfortunately, it was so successful financially that over 44 other manufacturers made similar devices. And even today, we have people who are making machines patterned after his goofy ideas, selling them on the market in the 1990s.
Dr. Abrams and his disciples treated thousands of patients. There are no records of how many people they cured or killed. The dynamizers and the oscilloclasts, machines that once gave hope to so many and made the doctor himself a millionaire, are now displayed as medical oddities. Dr. Abrams' obituary in the Journal of the American Medical Association granted him the title Dean of all 20th Century Charlatans. While he and his machines may not have diagnosed physical illness, he seemed exceptionally adept at detecting one human infirmity, gullibility. When the promise being offered is life itself, people pay dearly. The paintings of Johannes Vermeer, each one a priceless masterpiece, and yet Vermeer died in total obscurity in 1675. Of his life's work, fewer than 40 paintings are known to exist. Until this century, he remained virtually unknown. Today, he's considered a genius, praised by the art establishment as the great master of Delft. Blockbuster exhibitions of his paintings tour the world. Images from his rare originals are reproduced in a wide variety of forms, from postcards to wine bottles to T-shirts. The people buying these souvenirs know they're buying mere copies. But what if they didn't? During the Second World War, a series of never-before-seen Vermeers was discovered and sold for an unprecedented $50 million. And if it weren't for a bizarre twist of fate, no one would ever have known that they were forged. It was the biggest scam in art history. 1945. A special unit of Allied soldiers comprised of expert art historians made an extraordinary discovery. In a salt mine in Austria, they found a treasure trove of art stolen by the Nazis. These were Europe's greatest masterpieces, pillaged during the war by the invading German army. Amongst the booty was the collection of Nazi Field Marshal Hermann Goering. A Dutch art expert was shocked to notice that one of the paintings was a signed Vermeer. He knew the master's work, and he had never seen this painting before. An investigation was immediately begun to determine the origin of such a rare and priceless treasure. It was then discovered that, unlike the other paintings which had been looted, this one had been purchased recently from Holland. That a Dutch citizen would sell a national treasure to a Nazi was cause for outrage and suspicions of collaboration. A paper trail led through several intermediaries to this apartment in Neuspiegelstraat in Amsterdam, owned by the painter Han van Meegeren. While most people of Europe had suffered a great deal in the devastation of the war, van Meegeren lived very well. While others starved, there was always lots of food and wine on his table. He owned this property and 50 others, including 2 nightclubs. One morning late in May 1945, 2 uniformed Dutch police officers showed up at his door.
And they treated him with some respect because he was a very wealthy man. And they said to him, "No, look, we're not interested in how much was paid or anything else. We just want to know where this canvas came from." And Van Meegeren couldn't tell them. So they came back and arrested him with being a collaborator, which could have meant the death penalty.
The culprit was, in fact, guilty, but of a far more imaginative crime. Who was Han van Meegeren, and how did he come to possess an undiscovered Vermeer? The painter Van Meegeren was born in Holland in 1889. His artistic talent was clear from the start, and he avidly pursued his dream of painting like the Dutch masters. His own father despised his son's artistic inclinations and, in violent outbursts, frequently destroyed his artwork. But Van Meegeren ultimately found a mentor, a painter who taught the traditional methods of 17th century painting. While the art world hailed the new brilliance of Picasso and Matisse, Van Meegeren steeped himself in the style of another era. Though his technical virtuosity won some praise, by age 29, Van Meegeren's career had peaked. His work was panned or ignored by Holland's art critics, who branded it derivative and out of date. These early works, done in the old style, are examples of Van Meegeren's failure to meet the expectations of the critics. It also didn't help his career that he refused to bribe the critics, a common practice that bought many of his contemporaries glowing reviews. He recognized that in the art world, the nod of a few experts could make the difference between a worthless piece of canvas and $1 million masterpiece.
I had been so belittled by the critics that I could no longer exhibit my work. I was systematically and maliciously damaged by those who don't know the first thing about painting.
Van Meegeren's hatred of the Dutch art critics gave rise to a scheme for revenge. He decided to create a masterpiece that they simply could not ignore. Now his penchant for using outdated painting techniques, which had diminished him in the eyes of those same critics, could be used as ammunition against them. Van Meegeren may have fancied himself as a master painter, but he had all the instincts of a master con man.
But he did have this belief that the press and the critics and the experts and the art dealers were all venal, could be bribed, and were ignorant and didn't know their facts. And it was really originally to show up this incompetence and venality of the press and the media and the experts that he decided to paint a Vermeer, which would then be authenticated, and he would then say, I painted it. This proves that you're fools and I'm a great artist.
There was one very established critic who Van Meegeren particularly despised and who he thought would make an easy mark. Dr. Abraham Bredius had a theory about the early work and training of Vermeer. How happy and thrilled he would be to stumble upon an early Vermeer which would bolster his theory.
Abraham Bredius, the highly regarded and respected art historian, had a theory that, well, Vermeer, maybe he was in Italy, traveled there, maybe he has seen works by Caravaggio or other Baroque painters, and maybe he has made also religious paintings, and maybe these religious paintings look like this, a little sober, a little Protestant, a little like this and that. And in a way you can say that Van Meegeren used this theory by Bredius as a kind of how to make an early Vermeer painting.
To paint a fake Vermeer was a formidable challenge. Not only would it have to be stylistically brilliant, it would have to look 3 centuries old. But Van Meegeren was fueled by the passion of revenge. He found a 17th century canvas and with pumice, soap, and water stripped off the original paint. He experimented with 2 chemicals, phenol and formaldehyde, to create a synthetic aging process which would accomplish 3 centuries of paint hardening in 3 hours.
He was the first forger who had this idea to create a painting with a synthetic medium. And why would he do this? Because he had experience, he had read a lot of books, how they discovered forgeries, and it appeared to him that it was absolutely necessary to come up with something different.
Obsessed with detail, he used the same pigments Vermeer did, even hand-grinding ultramarine from lapis lazuli and blue from indigo.
He used a badger hair brush, which Vermeer also used. And he would take his pigment with the medium in it and then mix that through with the phenol and formaldehyde and then apply it to the canvas.
He then baked the painting just as you would bake a cake. To get the desired crackling in the finish, he went through one more step.
He would roll the painting over a drum, I'm simplifying it a little bit, that would open up also cracks, you know, they were coming from below, would open up the new paint layer. And then in order to make them more visible, he would then later wash over the whole surface with a black ink.
He then had a picture that was on a 17th century canvas, made with 17th century pigments, and the media had all evaporated, and the paint was perfectly hard.
5 years after his original research had begun, Van Meegeren finished the painting. He called it Christ at Emmaus. He felt it was a great painting, something he'd always dreamed of producing. But by signing it with Vermeer's monogram, he handed credit for his masterpiece over to another. Would it now withstand the scrutiny of the hated critics? Van Meegeren presented the painting to Dr. Bredius, who enthusiastically endorsed the work.
It was taken to Paris. It was seen by a number of potential buyers, including the representative of Lord Duveen in Paris, who wasn't fooled by it, and sent a cable which I've seen saying, "Picture rotten fake." Didn't want him to have anything to do with it. But Duveen's men were exceptions.
Despite the skepticism of the Parisian critics, the painting was endorsed by Holland's art establishment. It was given the place of honor in the Boymans Museum, and crowds came in unprecedented numbers to see it and to acclaim what Bredius had said was the greatest Vermeer.
So Vermeeren himself used to say that he went along as an ordinary member of the public to see this great Vermeer, and they had it roped off so that you couldn't get too close to it. And he walked up and had this moment of enormous pride at seeing his picture in pride place at the Boymans, and leant forward to examine it closely to see that the crackling was still all right and so on, and was moved back by an attendant. "Don't go too close to this canvas, don't go too close to this canvas." But he was just a member of the public looking at a great new painting.
This film, made in 1952, captures Bredius's excitement.
At this moment, the disciples have recognized Christ risen from the dead and seated before them. The disciple on the left shows his silent adoration mingled with astonishment. In no other picture by the great master of Delft do we find such sentiment, such a profound understanding of the Bible story.
Van Meegeren had done it. He'd painted as well as a great master. He'd fooled the art critics, including Dr. Bredius, Holland's leading expert on Vermeer. But instead of coming forward at this moment and exposing them to savor his great revenge, he found that he'd been caught up in the momentum of his own scam. The moment came to expose the fake, but Van Meegeren stalled for a simple reason: money.
When he sold the Emmaus, he sold it for, in today's money, $2.2 million. And suddenly he was wealthy.
Van Meegeren went to Paris and frolicked in the city's famous clubs. He still intended to reveal his forgery, but in the meantime he indulged himself with cabaret dancers, wine, even morphine. He was literally intoxicated with his newfound wealth. Exposing the forgery seemed less and less appealing. Van Meegeren had spent the money he'd made from the sale and realized that he could only continue to live well by churning out more forgeries.
He could have sold anything after the Emmausgangers. It was the Christ at Emmaus. It was, Bredius was positive, the museum, the Rembrandt Society, the museum directors in Berlin, in London, everybody accepted it immediately as a Vermeer. So, yeah, why not go on? It was one big illusion.
Trading in illusions, living the high life in Amsterdam, was too seductive for Van Meegeren to resist. He was transformed into a professional forger. Between 1938 and 1945, he painted and sold 6 more bogus Vermeers. The chaos of the Second World War provided the perfect camouflage for Van Meegeren to put his paintings on the market. As people attempted to flee the devastation of the war, important private art collections were being sold on the black market, with no questions asked. Masterpieces were changing hands without the usual documentation. When Van Meegeren claimed to have found one of his Vermeers in a farmhouse in Italy, there was no way of checking it.
Of course, it was strange to have suddenly 5 or 6 Vermeers in a few years time, but in those war days it was possible.
All these canvases had to be kept secret. They couldn't be exhibited, or the Nazis would get to know about them, and they would be looted. No one examined the paintings carefully. They were never x-rayed. They were never chemically analyzed. The canvas was never carefully examined. The very vague stories he told about their provenance were completely accepted. No one ever asked for additional details or made any attempt to trace where this painting had been for 300 years.
The Last Supper painting that was sold in 1942, 1.6 million guilders, and it was by then the most expensive painting in the world. Even Van Beuningen, who had a huge collection, he had to sell 20 paintings, including Tintoretto and Dürer and 18 other paintings, to get this Vermeer painting. So, yeah, you can imagine that when he heard at the end that this painting was a forgery, it was a drama.
The last of Van Meegeren's forgeries was Christ with the Adulteress. After he sold it, it changed hands several times, finally catching the eye of Nazi chieftain Hermann Goering, who paid the equivalent of millions of dollars for it. Though the fact was not known to Van Meegeren, this was the painting discovered by the Allied soldiers in the salt mine in Austria. When officials traced the painting back to Van Meegeren, he was vague about his involvement with it. He was thrown in jail and charged with treason.
Well, they took him to jail and they grilled him. They interviewed him very aggressively for several days. And after 3 or 4 days, he broke down and said, "You're fools. I didn't sell a great national treasure to the Nazis. I painted it myself, and I also painted the Vermeer in the Beimannsmuseum, the Vermeer in the Rijksmuseum." And the police then assumed that he'd invented this fantastic story in order to escape the more serious charge of collaboration, and said, "Well, Mr. Van Meegeren, if you painted this yourself, you could certainly make an exact copy of it." And Van Meegeren said, "I can do far better than that. I won't make a copy of a painting, but I'll paint a new forgery."
The police were astonished, but they gave their prisoner a chance to prove his innocence. Van Meegeren was locked into his studio under armed guard, and under those very difficult conditions, he began to literally paint for his life, for he knew that if he failed, he faced execution. Over the next 3 weeks, in the presence of police witnesses, he created a new forgery, which was the young Christ teaching in the temple. The creation of this painting captured worldwide press attention, and Van Meegeren emerged as a national folk hero, the underdog who had made buffoons out of all the experts. The new painting indeed stood up to scrutiny. The charge of collaboration was now changed to one of forgery. In a poll before the trial, Van Meegeren was voted the second most popular man in Holland, after the Prime Minister. On October 29, 1947, Van Meegeren's trial began right here. Ironically, this defendant wanted nothing so much as to be found guilty, because you see, that would prove that he was a genius.
Here we have that Van Meegeren, and it was, here I am, during his days in the court. Film crews from all over the world, his wife was there, and it was his triumph. Though in poor health at age 58, he was determined to appear debonair. He was not about to squander this moment in the limelight. The people who were giving evidence against him were the experts and critics who'd been duped by his work. Few wanted to give evidence because doing so was to admit their own incompetence and stupidity. A commission was set up to examine the paintings in a laboratory.
Van Meegeren also knew that his paintings, and that's very important, he knew that his pictures were going to be subjected eventually to X-rays. This is very interesting. He anticipated that. And so he used old paintings, as was done before, but in a different way.
17th century painters often painted over old canvases, and this, in fact, had made Van Meegeren's forgeries seem authentic. But now he could use this very point to prove that he was the forger. He told the commission exactly what images lay beneath the paintings, something that only he, as the forger, could have known. The painting Christ with the Adulteress was X-rayed. The radiograph of the framed part showed a battle scene. Likewise, the X-ray of the washing of the feet revealed a horse and its rider, exactly as Van Meegeren had predicted.
Van Meegeren, after the trial, after they also proved that his paintings were false, then he said, in the future it will not be possible at all to make any forgeries that pass these tests.
The commission unanimously declared all of Van Meegeren's Vermeers to be fake. After only 2 days, Van Meegeren was found guilty on the charge of forging signatures. He was sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment. Van Meegeren's downfall led, in a very real sense, to a triumph, for his revelations put the entire art establishment on trial. The con artist was convicted of forgery. The Marks were convicted of arrogance and incompetence. Because of his failing health, Van Meegeren didn't go to prison. Shortly after the trial, he was admitted to the Valerian Clinic. He died of a heart attack on December 29, 1947. Van Meegeren once wrote, "I want to see my paintings in great museums, if not as a reputable painter, then as a forger." His wish came true. Today, his forgeries not only hang in galleries, they're considered the most successful fakes of the 20th century.
I personally regard these paintings as very, very ugly. But for me, it's so strange that the big art historians, the big names from those days, that they regarded these paintings really as Vermeers or Pieter de Hoogs or whatever. It's incredible.
Again, I say it's easy to be wise after the event, but I think there's also something second or third rate about his forgeries. But of course, would I have said that in 1936? Would I have said it in 1942, when they were generally thought to be Vermeers?
In hindsight, you see, you can almost recognize any forgery, because the people who did not see right away that Van Meegeren had done these works, they were of the same period. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, this becomes more and more obvious.
But whether they would still be on show, the pride of the museum's collection, can only be speculative. I don't think Van Meegeren was a great painter. He was a great chemist, and a great psychologist, and a great technician. All these qualities were necessary for him to succeed as a forger.
If truth is beauty necessarily true? In Van Meegeren's case, the illusion was more powerful than the truth. His lie earned this odd, vengeful scoundrel a place in history, not only because of who he scammed, but because his scam was a masterpiece.
Step right up, friends and neighbors, and tell me, you sir, what is the first thing in your mind when you look in the mirror in the morning? And what's the last thing when you lay down to sleep at night? I know the question on your mind is, how am I fixed for soap? Well, for a mere $5, you can not only try a soap of unusual strength and purity, you can also have a dance with Lady Luck and find yourself not only a cleaner, but a wealthier man.
That was the pitch you could hear most days down at 17th and Larimer Street in Denver, Colorado, 1886. The trim-looking man with the basket of soap was Jefferson Randolph, also known as Soapy Smith.
Soapy Smith, who was the ultimate con artist of that era, was called Soapy Smith for that reason. He used to wrap bars of soap with $50 bills, with $10 bills, $20 bills, $5 bills, leave a corner sticking out, and sell them for $5 each.
By the time the purchased bar got to the anxious customer, however, the bills had inexplicably disappeared. Jefferson Randolph Smith was the oldest son of a genteel Southern family who left their home in Georgia to take up residence in Texas. There, as a teenager, he worked on the cattle drives along the old Chisholm Trail between Abilene and San Antone, driving Texas Longhorns along hot, dust-choked trails or plunging along with the herd into the raging waters of the Cimarron River was just part of the job. $30 a month was all a cowboy could expect in return for long and often dangerous hours in the saddle. One morning, Jefferson Randolph headed into San Antonio to see the circus. He had no idea he was about to lose his shirt and start a new way of life.
He was a very rational man. He had many attributes. He was the individual who could walk into a room and kind of light up the room, in several different ways, by the way. And he quickly learned when he was caught in a shell game, which is moving the pea under the 3 walnut shells, that he lost all of his earnings for several months in a few minutes.
Clubfoot Hall was one of the great shell game masters of all time, and it hadn't taken him long to fleece Jeff Smith of every penny. But Smith wasn't angry with the fast-talking Hall. He was envious. He decided right then to earn his living in a more rewarding way. He quit his job the next day and, determined to learn the shell game, joined the circus heading north. After honing his skills in the small frontier towns of Kansas and Colorado, Smith arrived in Denver in 1884. It was the bunco capital of the West. At the height of his Denver days, Soapy ran a saloon and a gambling hall. He organized a gang of fellow cons, and his accomplices were spread among dozens of legitimate and not-so-legitimate businesses. Bartenders, hotel owners, even madams provided him with the information he needed to work his cons.
And they had barbers on the list as well. And barbers tended to elicit information from individuals. They would quite often clip a little V in the back of their haircut, which meant that this one was a mark indeed. And Soapy Smith was quick to take advantage of that.
By 1893, Soapy was looking for new opportunities and headed to nearby Creede, Colorado. Creede was a boom town that grew up around the Holy Moses silver mine. With no existing government and no police force to contend with, Soapy Smith soon became de facto ruler of the town. In the saloons, card sharps mined for silver in the pockets of unwitting patrons, while on the streets, impromptu games of 3-card Monte and the shell game lightened their wallets. Soapy made money from it all. His smooth talk and ability to organize the other con men took him from being a mere street hustler to controlling an outlaw empire.
His confidence men were extremely well paid. I think he enjoyed the role. He was a study in contrasts, very genteel in many respects, aristocratic looking, spoke softly, was very, very eloquent in front of a crowd, and managed to convince people. Of course, this is one of the signs of a very fine confidence man.
In 1897, the SS Excelsior sailed into San Francisco with over $1 million in gold bullion on board. Gold had been discovered in the Klondike. The fever struck and the rush was on. With visions of immeasurable wealth filling their heads, masses of people abandoned their farms and families to seek their fortunes. Towns sprang up overnight. But along with prospectors who expected to get rich from gold, came con men who expected to get rich from prospectors. Back in Denver, Soapy quickly understood the role that geography was going to play. He realized that the town of Skagway in Alaska was the only gateway to the Yukon gold fields, and that all the fortune hunters would have to pass through it. Seeing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Soapy and his gang packed up their marked cards and crooked dice and headed for Alaska.
And of course, a boom town is established because of the wealth of either lead, zinc, or silver, or gold, or whatever the metal is. And they rose overnight. There weren't many laws in a lot of these towns. Certainly Colorado was an example. Skagway was a classic example. So they gravitated there, and who was to follow them? Well, the bunco men and the con artists, and they were there in all sorts of numbers, as well as the gamblers.
Frontiers are perfect setups. The reason they're ideal for these individuals is that the rules haven't been established yet. Everything goes. The law is, if it's there, it's sort of weak and amorphous and pretty ineffectual. So these individuals can get into areas where there is a breakdown in structure or where social structure has not yet developed, and they can function with impunity.
Soapy took Skagway by storm. His operations were well organized and his scams had a certain flair. Soapy opened a telegraph office. A miner arriving in town could send a telegram to his loved ones back home, assuring them of his safe arrival. Often a reply would come back the very same day. Each telegram cost $10. Thousands of messages were sent before anyone seemed to notice there were no telegraph wires in Skagway. He set up an information booth for miners on their way to the gold fields. Unlike most, this information booth specialized in extracting information rather than giving it. The hopeful miner was questioned as to whether he had enough money to make the trip to Dawson. Anyone with a large grub stake became the target for Soapy's schemes.
The average prospector is an optimist. He's waiting for a strike just around the next bend in the creek, or a creek that no one else has found, or perhaps a digging they've missed. It appeals to that type of individual. This is the type of individual who takes a chance. So they'll take a chance on the diggings. They'll probably take a chance on other things as well, and indeed they did. So they're set mentally to become a mark for the con men.
Soapy was the virtual dictator of Skagway. While his hired thugs beat, robbed, and sometimes murdered the miners, his accomplices in every gambling establishment, every bordello, and every bar in town fleeced them without mercy. Fixed card games and fake gold claims, stock swindles, and gold brick scams.
No one really touched Soapy Smith. And he had, of course, all sorts of reasons why he succeeded. He befriended the reporters, politicians of all stripes, right to the federal level, the police, of course. He had a network of Confederates and confidence men who felt that he was the ultimate confidence man and they would do very well under him.
What couldn't be taken by force was extracted by deception. Miners out for a good time were more than ready to pay for female company, which the dance halls were more than willing to supply. Dance hall girls like Klondike Kate and Snake Hips Lulu made small fortunes with a clever mixture of body charms and sleight of hand.
They danced with a man for $1. Usually the house would get 25 cents, they would get 75 cents. And that's where the term chip or chippy came up, actually, because sometimes there was more involved than that. But generally they worked for a percentage, and they also worked for a percentage of the drinks. So some of them did extremely well. Some of them had, at the end of their careers, certainly in Dawson City and in places like Skagway and Wrangell, they would have solid gold belts with $20 gold pieces in each one of the loops of the belt.
Soapy did have a big-hearted side, which he flaunted in grand gestures. Like a benevolent dictator, he wanted to be admired. He supported the local churches and started an adoption program for the abandoned dogs of Skagway. He himself took in 6 lucky stray mutts. On the 4th of July in 1898, Grand Marshal Soapy Smith led a spectacular parade through the streets of Skagway. It was his greatest moment. But even as Soapy enjoyed the acclaim of the holiday crowd, other events would soon dispel his illusions of grandeur. If Soapy had been able to limit his protection to confidence men and hungry dogs, he might have continued without opposition. But a much rougher breed was being drawn to Skagway, men who didn't hesitate at outright murder, and they too operated with Soapy's approval. The law-abiding citizens of the town started to feel that Soapy, despite his personal charm, was too much of a liability. J.D. Stewart, a miner on his way back to Vancouver Island, was robbed in broad daylight by a group of Soapy's thugs. It was the last straw for the respectable element of the town. A group of armed miners headed down to City Hall to deal with this latest outrage. Soapy headed there too, but this time neither his gift of oratory or his gang could save him. Nor could the loaded shotgun he was carrying. He was confronted by city engineer Frank Reed. They fired at the same time, and Soapy died instantly with a bullet through his heart. It had only been 4 days since his triumphant ride as Grand Marshal of the Independence Day Parade.
He had no compunction, no sympathy for stripping a man of everything he had. And sometimes he'd give him a square meal, that's about all. Not passage out of town, because passage out of town was on a sternwheeler or another ship, and that would cost too much, and Soapy wasn't about to do that. So he did have a weakness. He liked to be admired, and that's probably why he ended up virtually a destitute man at his death.
Soapy had gambled or given away the hundreds of thousands of dollars that passed through his outlaw empire. He wanted the admiration of society, yet he could not live within its rules. He chose the path of marked cards, crooked games, and easy money, a gambler to the very end. Those who knew him had a favorite memory of Smith sitting in the front pew on a Sunday singing his favorite hymn, "Free from the law, O blessed condition." Today we live in a world filled with many kinds of media where the truth may be manipulated in very sophisticated ways. We expect sitcoms and adventure stories to be the product of someone's imagination, but the news...
Feeling tired, maybe just a little bit stressed? Well, a visiting New York therapist says he has a roaring good way to chase away those blues, and he's trying it out in East London. Vince Rogers explains.
What exactly do I do then?
Roar.
Just roar.
This reporter thinks he's getting a scoop on a new age social therapy developed in California. He's really getting scammed. The man behind this caper is New York media hoaxer Joey Skaggs. Over the past 25 years, Joey Skaggs has created dozens of fabricated news stories, all disseminated through the mainstream media. He's created hoaxes such as impoverished artists living in water towers in Manhattan and curing baldness by transplanting scalps from cadavers. He even managed to hoax the game show To Tell the Truth and invented a story that received international attention, The Fat Squad.
And the Fat Squad consists of a contract that you would take out on yourself to rub out your own fat, a 3-day minimum, $300 a day, plus expenses. And every 8 hours, a new commando is with you to make sure that you don't break your diet. And we will physically restrain you with force if necessary. Our commandos take no bribes.
Whoa, wait a minute. No, not here.
Look at those strawberries.
Oh, yeah, look at those strawberries. Come on, let's do this thing.
Martha Wilcox is taking a tough new stand on dieting. No longer alone in a world of temptations, she'll have help staying on her latest. She's hired the Fat Squad.
I sent this out to the news media. It was picked up by the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Washington Post. They totally believed it. Made the wire services. I then went on national television, and it went around the world. Japanese television, German television, Italian television, French television, CNN, they all fell for it. I use the media as a painter would use a canvas. I'm a social-political media satirist. And what I mean by that is I create plausible but non-existent realities that are staged for the media.
But media, even when that only meant newspapers, has always had the means to manipulate the truth. Journalists and editors in the Old West well understood the public's appetite for sensational stories. Phony articles were dreamed up and published not just for fun, but for profit. The further away from its place of origin, the more likely it was for a tall tale to be printed as fact.
Every paper in Alaska or in California or along the frontier, every one of them was the kind of tabloid that would look silly, perhaps at your checkout counter today. But these were the regular newspapers of the time, and the hoax story was just another literary genre.
Early radio soon demonstrated even greater powers of persuasion. It was the night of Halloween, 1938. Orson Welles and a group of actors performed an adaptation of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a grave announcement to make. Incredible as it may seem, those strange beings who landed in the Jersey farmlands tonight are the vanguard of an invading army from the planet Mars.
All over America, listeners flew into a panic, believing the drama was real. People flocked into churches to pray. Emergency rooms were filled with people in shock. When the public realized the broadcast had been staged, the players were taken into protective custody for fear they'd be attacked by mobs of angry listeners. It was the most famous unintentional media hoax in history.
I'm, of course, surprised that the H.G. Wells classic, which is the original for many fantasies about invasions by mythical monsters from the planet Mars, should have had such an immediate and profound effect upon radio listeners.
With the arrival of television came the opportunity for more elaborate hoaxes.
The last 2 weeks of March are an anxious time for the spaghetti farmer. There's always the chance of a late frost, which, while not entirely ruining the crop, generally impairs the flavor and makes it difficult for him to obtain top prices in world markets. But now these dangers are over, and the spaghetti harvest goes forward. Spaghetti cultivation here in Switzerland is not, of course, carried out on anything like the tremendous scale of the Italian industry.
Beginning in the 1950s, the BBC elevated the art of the intentional media hoax to a new level. Their April Fool's Day broadcast of preposterous fake news stories has become an institution.
The secret is to get something which is just about believable, you know, stretches the imagination a little bit, but not too far. But in my experience, I've found that, in fact, the public are taken in by the most ridiculous lies and often don't believe those things which are actually true.
We didn't immediately recognize the significance of what we saw first when we entered Hopton Park. But these pictures, taken in very difficult conditions at 200 yards distance, disclose a reality more terrifying than anything our wildest suspicions had suggested. Not just the recombination of genes to make new species, but the recreation of species that died out millions of years ago.
There was something basically very wrong with their library. There were reports of books tumbling from the shelves, difficulties in opening and closing the windows, even trouble getting through some of the doors. The problems of living with the new library built up so much in the first few months that Grimond District Council decided to hold an investigation. Imagine the shock and embarrassment then for the townsfolk of Grimond when they discovered that their library, which looks like this, should in fact have looked like this. Their library had quite simply been built upside down.
The television and the media environment in general is reality making. But the media and media images, because they are so riveting and persuasive and fast-paced and frequent, serve to establish a basis upon which we define our reality, our very selves, our relationship to others. And because of that, media have great authority in our lives.
Joey Skaggs is convinced that the media's authority and power are not always deserved, and he's made a career out of proving how easy it is to fool them.
I give them what they want, what they're looking for, the hook. And my work is done in a number of stages. The first stage is the hook. That's where I come up with a concept, and then I figure out how to execute that concept, how it's going to work, what I need, and I stage the event.
This is Poplar's very own pride of lions, indulging in their rather peculiar form of group therapy. And of course, they have their own Lion King by the name of Baba Wa Simba. He's flown over from New York to lead the roaring sessions.
And then I document where it goes and who does what with it. I record the process of how the media interprets what I'm doing for their own purposes, what they do with it. And thirdly, I then reveal the truth. And that gets very interesting. And then I document what the media does with the truth. Do they address it? Do they ignore it? Do they trivialize me? Do they treat me like I'm the bad guy? Or am I the person with the message?
You're a reporter engaged in your professional practice. You got all these stories going on simultaneously. You're looking for leads, you get this call, you get these apparently valid and real press releases about a news story. You follow them up, you spend a lot of time doing it, whomp, you're off, back to the studio, I got to get the edit, it's got to be on the 6 o'clock and the 11 o'clock, and it goes on and on. And there's no time for engagement and reflection.
While Joey was developing his talent as a painter, he was also finding his role as social commentator and provocateur during the heady days of the 60s counterculture.
I constructed a life-size Vietnamese village portraying a Vietnamese nativity. I erected it in Central Park on Christmas, and I had a group of actors dressed as American soldiers attack it with fake guns to protest the war in Vietnam. And there were numerous arrests that day as well. And the New York Times covered the story and said something along the line that we were arrested for littering.
Skaggs was struck by the media's ability to reinterpret events for the public and decided to try to manipulate this power. And Roman Catholics attending the 1992 Democratic Convention in New York who didn't have time to confess had this unusual option, portafess, a portable confessional pulled by a bicycle. It was the brainchild of the Reverend Anthony Joseph, a.k.a. Joey Skaggs.
The hardest thing about that was designing the confessional booth. I had to have a tricycle custom made, and I had to get the priest's outfit, then to pedal up there and be exposed to about 15,000 journalists covering, the Democratic Convention. It was awesome. They were all over me. The journalists were all over me. I had actors posing as people coming in to confess. And then real people wanted to confess, and I had a hard time keeping them out. I said I was waiting for Ted Kennedy. You're drunk, come back again. And I found myself front page news, the Philadelphia Inquirer, CBS, Fox, CNN. Everybody jumped on the bandwagon. And finally, when they called up California, where I said I was from, as this priest, Father Anthony Joseph, the Archdiocese said, what are you kidding? We don't know this guy.
I think there's a professional pride. They don't like to feel that somebody can pull the wool over their eyes. I think they're angry because they can see the more serious side of it, that if somebody can hoax them on something that's fairly trivial, then perhaps somebody can hoax them on something much more sinister and more important.
How do you fool those whose very business it is to tell the truth? CNN, UPI, ABC, CBS. With a fax machine and some cooperative friends, Joey has scammed them all. His skill, like that of so many great confidence tricksters, is understanding the preoccupations of his own society. He knows exactly what his marks want to hear.
It's so predictable. You can make a calendar of events. You know what the media is going to be recording during the course of a year. They're going to have the homeless on Thanksgiving. They're going to be the anniversary of Chernobyl. There's always a disaster or an event. You can predict what stories they're going to cover. So you know what they're looking for, and it's really easy to tune in that way, and you can do an ironic reversal or a juxtaposition or even a statement along those lines, and you're pretty much guaranteed that that's going to push the button that they want to hear, and it's one way of getting access to them.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder in violation
of the O.J. Simpson murder trial. It was the biggest media circus of 1995, and it became the basis for an elaborate and thought-provoking media hoax. Skaggs called it the Solomon Project. Posing as a New York University professor named Dr. Joseph Bonuso, Skaggs sent a letter to over 3,000 judges, legislators, law enforcement officers, legal publishers, and law schools.
Now, the Solomon Project, I said, was 7 years in developing. We had over 150 scientists, artificial intelligence scientists and computer experts, lawyers and judges who were working on this project, and students. We were inputting all the laws of the land, both criminal and civil, into a series of supercomputers, and that these computers would be able to replace juries. I sent out a second press release saying that we were preparing a 15-city tour, we were soliciting cases that were controversial, we were going to retry them with a computer, and we were even going to retry O.J.
And then, beautifully, smartly, he throws in O.J., you know, and we know that CNN became O.J. TV. It became the fetish of America for a while, sadly so. And so he's got all the preconditions to carry out a hoax which is not merely a hoax, which is a critique and ultimately an indictment.
I sent out a third press release saying that we did retry O.J. and we found him guilty. Now, that's what everyone was waiting to hear. O.J. guilty. Of course he's guilty, but now we know, you know, look, the computer said he is guilty. So I really hit a lot of nerves with that one.
Skaggs had 24 hours to prepare for a CNN news crew intent on interviewing Dr. Joseph Bonuso. Of course, they also wanted to shoot a demonstration of the Solomon supercomputer at work.
We're on for two. We got about 25 people there, and we designed bogus screens, O.J. guilty, and all this stuff that was only literally a screen deep. There was nothing beyond it. And we did voice stress analysis. We could analyze your voice. You were telling the truth, you were not telling the truth, you were somewhat telling the truth, you were somewhat telling a lie, and all this was rigged, just totally, totally bogus. When CNN came in, they saw all these cameras, they saw these journalists, they see all these screens, all these computers. There's hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of equipment there. Well, it has to be real. And it's NYU Law School. Of course it's real.
The danger was that the crew might ask to see something that wasn't technically possible on the computer, or that the reporter would make inquiries at NYU Law School about their innovative professor. Neither one happened. The piece, complete with news desk intro, reporter stand-ups, O.J. file footage, and Joey's interview, was broadcast across the country on December 29, 1995. If you didn't catch it that evening, though, you're unlikely ever to see it.
A jury is a manipulated group of puppets. To do the last stage of what I do, which is to tell the truth, ultimately is the hardest thing because nobody wants to hear it. And when you try to gain access to the news media and say, listen, we're preparing a piece and showing how this was a hoax and what it's all about, we'd like to get permission to run this footage, they say no. They don't want the public to question their credibility as an investigative news source any more than they've already been questioned. I've been on some shows like a half a dozen times. I fooled CNN, I think, 5 or 6 times. Porterfest, Walk Right, Fat Squad, Bad Guys. It's always amazing to me when sometimes the same crew shows up. You know, a cameraman or a sound person from a previous hoax will show up and say, you know, this place looks familiar. There's a guy here who was making fish condos. Oh, really? And this has happened. I've been on Live at 5 about a half a dozen times. So it's kind of frightening when you think about, you know, how they don't remember anything. They don't care to remember. The story is more important than the truth sometimes. I don't measure my success by how many people I fool, how many newspapers or radio stations or magazines I fool, but how many people I'm able to reach with the message that we are all being fooled.
When will Skaggs strike again? On more than one occasion, he's told reporters that he's perpetrated his last hoax.
I swore that this would be the last one.
Is this the last of your hoaxes?
Oh, sure. I'm not going to do this anymore. I decided that I've had it with hoaxes. Too many people have seen my face. It's going to get really difficult to do this, so I'm going to quit.
Joey Skaggs doesn't break the law, and he doesn't profit from his schemes, but to those he's duped, he's a scoundrel. As someone who makes expert use of the con artist's bag of tricks, Skaggs may make us laugh, but he also wants us to look more carefully at the truth that we're being sold. Where the foibles of human nature and the well-tested rules of deception meet is where the con artist plies his trade. But without willing believers in the promise of instant riches, a miracle cure, or an undiscovered masterpiece, the scam is just another game of solitaire. Lustig knew he had to act. He set out to meet his mark that evening back at the hotel, this time in private. There he confessed, or so it seemed.
Monsieur Poisson, I'm sorry we have to meet like this, but it's important we understand each other. I'm a government official. I'm expected to live in a certain style so as to maintain the dignity of France. I must dress well and entertain on a lavish scale. I don't have to tell you that I make only a pittance. My life is precarious. When a premier falls, my job is on the line. And so it is that in the letting of government contracts, I maintain my security. It is customary for the official in charge to receive a commission.
Poisson was relieved. Finally, he understood this official's mysterious behavior. Lustig wanted a bribe. Poisson smugly reached inside his jacket and removed his wallet.
When Lustig asked him, on top of a blank check, for a bribe for himself as a poor government official, Poisson took this as proof that Lustig was in fact a bona fide government official. He was used to the idea of bribery as part of the everyday business of government, and provided these two checks.
You know, he posed as a government official, but he posed as a corrupt government official. You give me, you grease my palm, and I'm going to give you the inside track on that. And all of a sudden, here in the mind of this somewhat greedy, probably not terribly bright, but hey, maybe not so very different from the rest of us, scrap dealer, came the idea that, aha, now I understand. I understand the secrecy. I understand you. You're a crook. You're the kind of crook I'm used to dealing with. Well, he was a crook, of course, but he was a very, very different kind of crook.
You see, in Poisson, Lustig had discovered the perfect partner, the mark who wants to believe.
The con works, one, because the con man is good, but secondly, because, we meet him more than halfway. In a lot of these cases, there's more than a little larceny in the heart of the person who is being conned.
Lustig was in danger. Poisson would call the ministry, and then very likely the police. Lustig hopped a train to Vienna with a suitcase full of Poisson's money. He checked into one of the city's best hotels and watched the papers for news of the scam. But nothing appeared. Apparently, Poisson was too embarrassed to tell anyone that he'd been had.
Poisson was left calling the city on the phone to saying, when should I show up to help take down the tower? And we can imagine that the ministry was rather amused by the foibles of the unfortunate victim.
6 months later, Lustig was back in Paris. Taking advantage of the fact that Poisson had felt too humiliated to report the scam.
Oh, the mark tells you what his opinion is, and of course you agree with him. That's, naturally. You do not try to pull personal information out of the mark, even if you want it and really sincerely need it. Don't try to pull it out, because people are going to tell you. Just let it ride, let him talk. He's going to tell you what you want to know. You don't brag about yourself. You brag about yourself, people don't trust you. You have to exude the authority. It has to look right.
Once they were back on the ground, Lustig asked the gentlemen to submit their bids by the next day, and he reminded them that they were in possession of a state secret. The next morning, bids from all 6 dealers arrived, but Lustig had already made his choice. The dubious honor would go to the socially insecure and very ambitious André Poisson. Lustig had easily picked up on his desire to join the business elite of Paris. If Lustig was the perfect con artist for the times, Poisson was the perfect mark. He was from the new class of wealthy entrepreneurs who had made a fortune after the war, and he had plenty to prove. The old boy network had shut him out of Parisian high society, and Poisson wanted in. What better way than to win the Eiffel Tower contract?
One can imagine that a provincial scrap metal dealer would see this as the means to really make his fortune. It was really an attractive prize for someone like that. Perhaps the grandeur of the deception was the key to its success. The tower, of course, itself was always a grand object, always subject to very exalted kinds of attentions, whether by artists or by planners. It made people think globally. It made people think big, and it certainly made Poisson think big as well.
5 lucky scrap metal dealers had narrowly escaped Lustig's trap. With Poisson in his net, Lustig was one step closer to a small fortune, but he was also at risk. Impersonating a deputy minister, larceny? Lustig knew that if he were caught and stood in front of a French judge, his cheeky scam would be severely punished. Lustig's fears were justified. In fact, Poisson's wife had become suspicious. She questioned her husband. Why was the meeting not held at the ministry? Did Andre know this official? Why was the city's plan being enacted with such haste?
Now at this point, Lustig realized that all Poisson had to do was make a few discreet inquiries and the game was finished. So what did he do? Quit? Run? Oh no. Not as long as there was some chance of saving this game. He showed his true mettle as a genuine confidence artist. He not only had proven he was clever, he was now about to show that he had nerves of steel.
Well, one thing, he's a risk taker. I mean, you know, you're out there scamming people, and you don't know, hey, maybe they'll find you up, maybe they'll put you in jail. He did go to jail a couple of times. Maybe they'll shoot you. I mean, he was a card sharp for a while. You know, sometimes somebody catches you with the wrong cards, bang, that's it. He seemed to enjoy that kind of danger.
Time and place for Victor Lustig, then Paris, 1925.
After World War I, the youth of France was happy to be alive and sought to create a new social order with more freedom and greater opportunity. Expatriates of all kinds descended in droves upon the City of Light. A new class of entrepreneur emerged, made wealthy by the rebuilding of Europe. It was a city filled with effervescent excess. Here, amidst the creative fervor, the nouveau riche mingled with old money, and exiles from Prohibition America and Bolshevik Russia converged in what seemed to be one big party. Paris was ripe for change, and anything seemed possible. The perfect place for Victor Lustig to pull off the swindle of a lifetime. As a young man, Lustig left his birthplace in Eastern Europe, and by the time he was 20 years old, had already proven his talent as a first-rate grifter. His gift for languages and his easy charm served him well in his partnership with the infamous card sharp Nicky Arnstein. Together, they worked the big ocean liners which sailed between Paris and New York, ships which were always rife with gullible and wealthy marks. When he left Arnstein, Lustig had a booty of $35,000, and he headed for Paris.
By now an experienced confidence trickster, he moved gracefully in society, always stylish, always in control, and more importantly, always looking for the next opportunity to work a scam.
It came to him one spring day through an intriguing article in the local newspaper, which provided the Count's cunning mind with enough material for a caper of truly monumental proportions. According to the daily press, the Eiffel Tower was in a terrible state of disrepair, and estimates on its upkeep were astronomically high. The price of a new coat of paint alone could reach into the hundreds of thousands of francs. Lustig's inventive mind went to work. What would happen if the city decided it could no longer afford the tower? Would they dare tear down this glorious spire? What an enormous and controversial job that would be. Who would do it? There would have to be a contract, he supposed, and where there's a contract, there's usually a bid. Lustig's scheme was taking shape. Always the chameleon, Lustig would transform himself into a high government official. His disguise would have to be flawless, every detail perfect. He hired a forger to create counterfeit government stationery and sent 6 of Paris' leading scrap metal dealers authentic-looking invitations to attend a very secret meeting. So secret, it couldn't be held at City Hall. Lustig chose a grand setting to lay his trap. The magnificent Hotel Crillon on the Place de la Concorde was an exclusive meeting place for diplomats, dignitaries, and royalty. One could hardly enter its doors without feeling a certain sense of heightened expectation, even perhaps.
The Eiffel Tower, up for sale? Hard to believe, but master swindler Victor Lustig convinced his mark that it was. A medical marvel. Was Dr. Abrams' box a remedy for the sick, or only designed to enrich the scoundrel who created it? These works of art, bearing the signature of Dutch master Johannes Vermeer, today hang in museums as masterworks of deception. Do you believe everything you see on the news? How about a nationally reported story about a computer that determines the guilt or innocence of suspected criminals? Host James Randi, professional skeptic and debunker of frauds, takes us through the conception, the setup, and the payoff of these remarkable scams.
We've all heard that anything too good to be true probably is. But the charm and ingenuity of a great con artist can make us believe that maybe, just this once, fortune has swung in our favor. How does the scam artist do it? What principles of human nature play into the scoundrel's hand? And when it's all done, are we any wiser or just poorer? From seasoned swindlers like the globe-trotting Victor Lustig and boomtown hustlers like Soapy Smith, to the vengeful genius of painter Han van Meegeren and modern-day media hoaxer Joey Skaggs, the scam and the scoundrel have remained remarkably unchanged through the centuries. I'm James Randi, and in this special presentation, we'll look at the inner workings of some of history's most outrageous scams and the confidence men behind them. Now, most cons follow a very simple set of rules. The first rule is that the con artist always wins. Few men have earned the title among criminals of King Con. Victor Lustig was one of them. An aristocrat of the underworld, he was known to his peers as Count Lustig. The caper that immortalized him as one of the greatest confidence artists in history occurred in Paris, where he lined up a scheme to sell something that weighed 11,000 tons and didn't belong to him. It's been said that every society gets the crooks it deserves. In a world where wealth and prestige are admired, the con disguises himself accordingly, often playing the role of an aristocrat or high government official. In times of change and social upheaval, the con enjoys a greater freedom to masquerade across the boundaries of class and wealth. The successful con artist is always a kind of mirror for the time and place in which he operates. And there couldn't have been a riper bit of self-importance. All 6 scrap metal dealers responded to Lustig's invitation and attended the meeting, each one put at ease by the presence of his successful colleagues. And by the time the Count had introduced himself as the Deputy Director General of the Ministry of Post and Telegraph, well, they were convinced that they were all going to be part of something very significant and perhaps profitable. He told the dealers that they had each been handpicked for their flawless reputation as honorable businessmen. Then, in a hushed voice, Lustig explained that due to the exorbitant cost of its upkeep, the city had no choice but to tear down the Eiffel Tower. The men were shocked. Lustig pressed on. Because of the certainty of public outcry over this matter, the news could not be revealed until all the plans were in place. He explained that he would have the duty of selecting the man to carry out the demolition.
The idea that the Eiffel Tower was going to be sold for scrap, again, wasn't all that goofy. It was in serious need of repairs. You look upon it today as this thing which you know, Paris wouldn't be Paris without it, but back then, It wasn't quite as famous.
No doubt there were many people who would have preferred it come down. They could not yet see it as a permanent feature of the Parisian landscape necessarily. It didn't look like any of the most well-known monuments of the city, like the Opera House or any of the Gothic cathedrals and churches. It looked more like a machine, and as a machine, it had the look of quickness.
Monsieur, la Tour Eiffel, s'il vous plaît. From the meeting, Lustig whisked all 6 men into a limousine for a special tour of the tower. It was a calculated move. Understanding human nature as he did, Lustig wanted to dangle the prize before their eyes.
Gentlemen, the tower was never meant to be permanent. As you know, it was built for the 1889 exposition with a 20-year concession to Mr. Eiffel. In 1909, it was to have been taken down and reassembled somewhere else. This, of course, didn't happen. Unlike our city's other monuments, the tower is made of 15,000 prefabricated parts which can be assembled and disassembled. Think of the uses, collectible and otherwise, to which these highly ornamented parts could be put, and imagine their value.
The outing also gave the Count the chance to observe the men individually and pick which would be his mark, the victim he would cut from the herd.
He had a set of rules that, in order to sort of get people to trust you, one thing is you listen very patiently to people. You don't look bored. You don't express controversial opinions until